Thank you very much. We're in your hand. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Well, thanks very much, Michael. It's a great pleasure to, well, great opportunity for me. I mean, to be able to talk to you all in these sorts of times. So I'm very grateful for the invitation. And so what I'll do is what I'd like to do is to sketch out the history of how I came to do what I'm doing, because there is a horrible, looking back as an older person, there is a great deal of continuity and delay in the process by which I have finally arrived at finishing this book. So the book, I mean, the subtitle of the book, to give it a kind of clearer definition, is The Invention of a Discipline, 1850 to 1950. And so the time period I'm looking at is development of the way economics developed as an academic discipline from roughly the mid 19th century to about, well, just the immediate post-war period, the 1950. The 1850 cutoff is to do with the way that, as developed in the book, it's at that time that really popular education, extension teaching, publications, associations, the Social Science Association in Britain began work. And the focus is initially on Britain because it was in Britain that the first 3-year academic degree in economics was created in 1903 in Cambridge. And so the focus on the big initial focus is on Britain because of the way in which it was in Britain that everything came together to create an actual 3-year formal degree before anywhere else. Economics have been taught, obviously since what we would think is economics since the 18th century, but as a program recruiting students in university and so forth, it really gets going in the later 19th century, and I'll talk about that a bit more. The 1950 cutoff date is to do with the fact that it's still very much British based, and it's possible. My basic framework is that I've formulated was to say it took until roughly the 1930s and 1940s for what we what we now would consider to be the sort of modern economic framework to get organized. And of course, by then, this is happening mostly in the United States. But the importance of the post-war period from post-1945 is that this language, in a sense, which had been created, first entered civil public administration in a big way in the later 1940s, 50s. And so the language of politics became an economic language, which it had been, for example, in the Soviet Union in the 1920s and 30s in a different sort of way. But this is a kind of way that there's a kind of rough division one can make between the development of a discipline with its language and its institutions and its careers and its journals and its publications and its students and its training programs, which is what I write about. And then the use of this language in public policy, because roughly speaking, public policy wasn't actually formulated in a systematic way like this in peacetime in the interwar years or before the First World War. So that's the rough explanation of that. More prosaically, in terms of the way this started off as British material, is one can say there are virtually no records for academic or development of academic economics in British universities from 1940 onwards, apart from in Cambridge and only to some extent, London and the LSE. Basically, you can't reconstruct the history of economics in Britain in the 1950s and 1960s and 1970s in any great detail because there are no institutional records surviving to speak of, unlike before that period. And so that was a kind of thing. And also it becomes much more complicated. And so anyway. So my time frame is strictly that. It's to do with this invention of a discipline, which is a Cambridge-oriented matter. But importantly, my argument is that there are two aspects to that argument. The argument is that actually everywhere around the world in the later 19th century, arguments were being made for the training of young people in the kinds of skills and practices that were important for the new industrializing economies, effectively. So this is, so to put it more generally, and this is something which from my involvement in the institutionalized project based in Cambridge in the 1980s became very clear. So we're talking about North America, Europe, and Japan as all on the same page, effectively, in the later 19th century. But the important point was most of these arguments made about the appropriateness of education, as it were, or training to the future labor force, were made in terms of commercial education. And Alfred Marshall was unusual in that he argued that economics, what he regarded as economics, and he made this argument in his inaugural address in 1885, it was economics which had to be taught as a major sort of vehicle for this. So that was what was unique about Marshall's argument. Not that he was arguing that economics was important for public administration and business and so forth, and those familiar arguments. That the general argument wasn't unique. What was unique was the idea it was economics that was going to do this, and he was the only person, as it were, or it was because of him, and also, which I'll talk about, the qualities of Cambridge, which meant that he could turn these ideas into the 1903 economics Tripos, and that became a template in some respects for further developments around the world. But my other argument is that this emphasis on commerce and commercial education is exactly what motivated the foundation of the London School of Economics in 1895. The London School of Economics was essentially, for the first 50 odd years of its existence, up until the mid 20th century, overwhelmingly an institution devoted not to the science of economics and politics, as its title and the library would give you, but actually to mainly vocational training. And the number of students who actually, as it were, majored in economics were very, very small at the undergraduate level. London School of Economics was aligned with, well, you could say Harvard Business School. I mean, the same sort of stuff. And so most students who did the BSc Econ, which was founded in the early 1900s as the London University degree, most students who did the BSc Econ actually majored, as it were, but they did a bit of economics in their first year, but mostly they were focused on sociology, social administration, public administration, and economic history. And only very few of them actually ended up doing main economic subjects, only a handful. But what happened in the 1930s was that Robbins was appointed in 1929, and he set about expanding the role of the teaching of economics and created a new style. And in the process, brought an end to the Marshallian initiative. And I'll talk a bit about what I mean by Marshallianism in the course. I should do as I go through. And so basically what I'm saying is that what we might regard as Marshall and Marshall's influence and so forth really is waning by the late 1920s in terms of influence, and it's the LSE which is important. And the reason why the LSE is really important is because of its external degrees as well. It basically set the curriculum for all new economics departments in Britain after the war. It had it had all the textbooks effectively, from Benham to Stonier and Hague to Lipsey and even to Loudon Ryan, all derived from the LSE economics curriculum effectively. They were sort of derivative of the LSE. And a lot of the staffing of new departments and so forth in the 1950s and 1960s, the expansion period of economics in Britain, was based on the LSE. So the LSE, because of its position within the London University and the fact that it was an imperial university, in effect, we had external degrees, people could sit degrees in commerce and economics all around the world, effectively. And this has never been recorded properly, for example, because the London University records for this are in an appalling state. And so you have to go through every year's announcements to actually, I mean, the London University records of their degrees up until probably the 1980s or 1990s are annual bound copies of the notices which they posted up for students. No more than that. It's nothing more than that. It's not even in a published form. It's just a printed notice. So you had to go through all that in the archives. But so I've been talking about the LSE in Britain, but the important problem here, and actually it's a persisting problem. I was thinking about this the other day, is that after the war, Britain focused upon undergraduate education. There was hardly any graduate education in Britain in the humanities and social sciences. Obviously, in medicine, engineering, natural and life sciences. But in terms of the humanities and social sciences, undergraduate teaching remained the focus and does so today. I mean, and what I think, without being too political, the fact that we have a prime minister who has an Oxford undergraduate degree in classics, that's all he has. I mean, just a 3-year degree. What do undergraduates know, really? That graduate training is very important in terms of developing people's ideas, and importantly, and this is what the heft that the Americans gained very quickly in the 1930s. Importantly, graduate education gives academic staff people to talk to and work with, young people to talk to and work with. Undergraduate education doesn't. And I've made this argument, and it's a chapter following this one, chapter 5 in the book. I made this published earlier research I'd done on the Cambridge Tripos, and basically Harry Johnston's critique of Cambridge teaching in the 1950s, basically, he was talking about, but actually remains true. That there's a real problem about if your education is focused heavily on undergraduate teaching, as the British system is still, then there's a problem about the level to which graduates actually have got. I mean, their understanding of a subject or general intellectual training, and also the fact that there's a lack of this kind of graduate culture and graduate programs and so forth, which actually are very, very important for the development of a discipline. And I think the problem persists. What the context which I was thinking was actually in terms of the current British government's idea of a sort of tilt to Asia and so forth. And they're basically decades late. That's the basic problem. When I went to Germany in 1979 on a Humboldt postdoc, so it's a government program, postdoc program. I noticed, well, I was actually told by Jeff Ely, who'd done his work there, the British historian Jeff Ely, had done his work there before me. He said, well, you're likely to get this because there are so few British applicants, and there are not hardly anyone in history. So you'll get this. And when I looked at the intake, as it were, the publications of the Humboldt Stiftung, there were large numbers of Indian natural scientists and engineers and so forth. The Humboldt program in the late 1970s in Germany was a program for bringing in bright people from emerging economies and forging links. And so that was, a long time ago. And so now British universities have major links with obviously Chinese students, but these Chinese students are mostly undergraduates. So there's still this kind of, so that in a sense, the issue I identify in the course of my book about the reason why America developed so quickly, because it's much bigger, obviously, and the problem why Britain never kind of made this transition until perhaps the 1980s or 1990s in economics, meant that basically there's a real limitation on what you can do with the discipline. So that's my that's my overview and the kind of the location of what I'm talking about. But so to go back to where I planned to start talking, was that really the project which my whole book comes out of goes back to my final undergraduate year in 1971. In fact, I did. First of all, I first read Malthus. Then I was doing a history of sociology course. I went to the library and took out Malthus' Principles of Political Economy. Such a fantastic library, new university. I took out the 1820 edition off the shelf from the library and looked at it and thought, oh, this is interesting. This is part of the history of the social sciences, and this is something I'm interested in. Secondly, shortly after that, I wrote a term paper on Kuhn's structure of scientific revolutions and took as a case study, rather oddly, the Russian Revolution in art of sort of early 1900s to early 1920s. And that was important because actually that brought me into connection with Russian formalism, which is incredible literary criticism, which gave me a lot of my interest in language and how texts work. But also then with Kuhn, by the end of 1971, I'd written a paper which just said Kuhn is absolutely hopeless as a point of departure. And it puzzles me that people still talk about Kuhn today, because the book is so riven with difficulties and problems that it is no point of departure or anything. So, but the question is, how do ideas change, and how do we, in terms of the political economy we know about, how do you get from Smith to Ricardo to Mill to Marshall to Jevons to Cassell to Pareto and Keynes? How does this work? How do you move forward without assuming that we know what economics is and imposing this idea on what goes before? So what I had this idea, and this is where I started out. But then, and I went off to Germany. I learned German, and then I started a graduate degree in Cambridge, and I still really didn't know clearly what I wanted to do. But actually, I got interested in economics. I had intended to study economics major in Essex originally, but I'd been diverted from that. But this was the early 1970s, and what struck me was how bad academic economists were about talking about the problems of the end, basically what was the end of the long post-war boom, financial problems with the IMF, problems with energy and all sorts. And in Britain, obviously, the early 1970s wasn't great. And so why is it that what's happened? Why is it that these economists seem so incapable of using their knowledge to address what are clearly contemporary economic problems? And so that was my point of departure. And really, in a sense, that's what thing I've been looking to actually develop since then. So then I said, so I went off to Germany. I did work, I turned into a proper historian in Germany in the 1980s, and wrote a book for the Germans on 18th century economics, if you like, Cameralism. And the point here was to say, okay, there was some sort, what we might say, economic teaching in academic institutions, in universities, and we can use this. It's an enormous. Well, I should also say, in terms of the early modern material, my view is there's just an enormous amount of a field of economic discourse, the word I used in my first book, just vast mass of material. And how do you start to make any sense of all of this? How do you make sense of it? And what we should not do is use current economic theory or thinking to kind of demarcate and decide what it is that is interesting about this material. And so the point about my study, published in 1988 on German institutions, was to say, in order to understand what these people are writing about, we need to understand what the writing is for, and the dynamics, the institutional dynamics which govern it. And so, who are they teaching? In what sort of institutions are they? Which are successful institutions? Which are unsuccessful institutions? How are careers structured? Who goes what? How does the literature develop? And really, in a sense, what I'm saying is that the 1988 book on 18th century Germany became, in a way, the template for my thinking about transferring that idea to initially British economics. It sort of broadened out after that. And so it's this kind of way of making sense of a body of economic talk, discourse, in terms of pulling it into some sort of order by looking at how it's used and what it's for. So trying always to keep in mind this view that there is this vast mass of material that you have to things. So that, for example, when I did my graduate work, what I did, I created a bibliography of the stuff I was going to look at simply by going through the Goldsmiths catalogue and writing down sources year after year from that, so that I wasn't dominated by whatever people happened to think was interesting in, I don't know, the late 18th century or whatever. So I did exactly the same with the German work. There's a big bibliography of this writing published in 1937. And I just went through that, and I just copied out index card after index card, assembling some kind of field from which I could then start to make sense of. And I didn't do exactly the same with this material, but this is how I'm going to go back to all of this, is in my future work. Is actually I've gone back to index cards, because you can shuffle them and look at them in a way you can't do on screen. And so this is an important thing, the idea of a big field of work. So that book of 1988 was a template in a way. It's a German book written for Germans using German methods. And so out of that, I then got, in 1989, I got an ESRC grant and started on what became this book. So it's got a long history. Most of the actual archival work was done in the 1990s. And of course, the important point here then becomes, although all my notes are on a computer, this is pre-digital. So I had vast amounts of Xeroxes. I've got 2 big boxes of Xeroxes from the Cambridge University Reporter. Just went through all these stuff and Xeroxed all this stuff, which then created this physical problem of how do I get, in this small study I've got here, how do you get all this material and actually look at it and make sense of it? And out of that also, I realized by the mid-1990s that I needed to talk to senior economists who were nearing the end of their lives. And so I developed a program of going and interviewing senior economists to see how they had built departments in the 1950s, and it turned out they couldn't remember mostly. But what they were very clear about, unusually clear about, and demonstrably and verifiably clear about, was why they had become economists in the first place. And so I had a number of very interesting interviews with people in the, from actually one guy from Manchester who had been there in the mid-1920s, and more recently on the LSE, it turned out one of my later interviews, which was from the late 90s, on LSE, from someone who graduated in 1931, I think it was, and who was actually went there, started his study of economics at the same time that Robbins went to LSE. And I published a book about that, which basically was hardly reviewed because of the publisher at the time. And I ran out of steam, more or less, about that time. I published this book. There'd been virtually no reception to it. Publishers weren't interested in what I was doing, and so I shifted off to the stuff on Weber, mostly in the early 2000s. Plus, also, I left university because I found teaching from textbooks and so forth, not being able to invent courses anymore. I found that not particularly interesting. Ironically, with our history of economics course in Birmingham, Roger Backhouse and I have written our own textbook, and we do teach what we want. But mostly, I found the teaching I was doing in the 1990s, early 2000s was simply generic and uninteresting. So then I mentioned this problem, the physical problem of all this material. I had digital notes, but vast number of Xeroxes. And then in 2017, I went to SCAS in Uppsala, and I was given this lovely big office. And so there at last, I could actually get all this material out, and it's there that I was able to physically organize all this diverse material I'd accumulated. And of course, also material that I would never be able to use. I mean, so the amount of detail I couldn't use. And out of that is where I actually managed to devise this book. So, having said all that, the drift of going through and it's very clear in the chapter that I sent, in chapter 4, that I'm now going to talk about particularly, is that if we can actually establish what has been taught, or how economics has been taught, in what institutions, with what means, by what kind of teacher, we have a consistent means historically of understanding what economic knowledge, or good or bad economics, might have been or possibly could have been at any one point in time. So it provides a kind of calibration of economic knowledge. And it's important not to simply impose our present ideas on the past, obviously. And so it's a way around this. Using this institutional foundation, we can, as it were, reimagine what it must have felt like in the 1820s to talk about political economy, for example, or what it must have felt like in the 1880s, importantly in Britain, to have thought about economics. Whether you were Jevons or whether you were for Mill, and how Mill and Jevons possibly would come together. So, in a sense, that's the first thing. The second point, in terms of the role of the university, is as a second chapter in my book, is on the creation of what I call a modern university, which is a sort of German-American creation, effectively, in the late 19th century. But basically, what happened quite quickly from the late 19th and early 20th century, with the creation of the outlining of what could be called a discipline of economics, was the legitimation of economic argument. And so what counts as good economic argument, and this is actually obviously across the board with university disciplines, is validated by the fact this is what the academy thinks is proper knowledge. And we see this obviously in the battles about heterodox economics and what could be called mainstream. So there's a kind of core which is which is upheld by, in a sense, the core institutions. I mean, so there's a kind of pecking order, and so it's an institutional matter. What counts as good economic knowledge? Obviously, there are epistemological concerns as well, but generally speaking, in terms of what sticks and the strange persistence of old ideas, can be attributed to just simply this kind of process of teaching and the way things get written to textbooks. I mean, the Chinese whispers ideas, are very important in that. And so, one of the important features of an academic discipline is to do with this legitimation of knowledge. And so that's the general focus. And so now I'll talk a bit about I'll talk about the moral sciences tripos at last. I'll do it for another 20 minutes or so. So the problem, basically, we know about Alfred Marshall. We know that Alfred Marshall wrote the Principles published it first in 1890, that he was instrumental in creating the Economic Journal by virtue of the position he had at the time in the British Association. He was able to get everything aligned so that the British Economic Association was formed, which then in turn published the Economic Journal starting in 1891. And this is a vehicle for discussion among economics. Importantly, unlike the American Association formed later at the time, importantly, the Royal Economic Society has never until relatively recently been a forum for discussion among economists. The Royal Economic Society, as created as the British Economic Association, was a vehicle for publishing the Economic Journal and reprints of important texts. I mean, obviously, the Ricardo and Keynes editions are examples of that. But that's so there was the Economic Journal was the vehicle through which British economists could understand what was going on in Britain. And also importantly, and this is the important role of journals then, as with with the American and the German and the French and the Dutch and the Swedish journals at the time, they all had summaries of what was going on internationally in the back. And so by reading any one of these journals, you would get a sense of the international development of modern economics and so forth. And this has all really helped converge things. And then, of course, Marshall created the Tripos in 1903 by taking the teaching of economics out of the moral sciences Tripos and making economics a standalone discipline or standalone examinable subject. And importantly, there are two things that tend to get forgotten about this. And so, why did he want to do this? And secondly, the part of the answer to that can be imagined by saying, well, the moral sciences Tripos then became the philosophy Tripos in short order after that. And so, in a sense, that answers the question, because by taking economics and politics out of the moral sciences Tripos, you got left with what actually then became Cambridge philosophy. And so, in a sense, that gives you a new perspective on what Marshall thought was wrong with moral sciences Tripos as a vehicle for teaching economics. It's only part of the answer. But generally, people have actually always thought that, well, it's obvious that, what Marshall is doing is freeing economics from the moral sciences Tripos. And it's obvious that this thing, economics, exists, and he's freeing something that pre-exists from this hull, this shell, which is impeding its proper development. But that, I think, is a wrong way around to look at it. What we need to know is I started out from a position where I thought of was what was lost when the economics left or separated itself off from psychology and philosophy, moral philosophy, and ethics and logic. What was lost? And the answer is actually the moral sciences Tripos as it existed was more or less recreated in the Oxford PPE in 1920, and this is now, it's the irony of the major irony in British public life is the fact that the PPE is actually now the qualification of a choice for politicians and journalists and people in public life and all this sort of stuff. This is the major single unifying factor among large numbers of networks. And so this is what Marshall had envisioned, but in a completely radical form, the form that he wanted to do without. So the PPE is rather like the moral sciences tripos as it existed in the late 19th century, and Marshall wanted to detach himself from that. But so there are other points as well. So we need to understand what the moral sciences tripos is, but then also importantly, we need to understand what the maths tripos was in Cambridge, because there was actually in Cambridge really for much of the 19th century only one degree, well, for the first half, only really one degree, the maths tripos. If you wanted to do classics, you had to do the maths tripos first and then go on to classics. Now it was it seems to be with Prince Albert in the 1840s he became Chancellor of Cambridge, and when he saw what Cambridge University taught, coming from strangely enough he went to the University of Bonn the year after Karl Marx did, and also followed exactly the same courses that Karl Marx had followed. But he'd done 1 year at a German university, and he was so familiar with German universities, and coming from Germany and becoming Chancellor of University of Cambridge, he was, I think, pretty horrified at what was the limited nature of what was done in Cambridge. Because what we must remember is Cambridge is still a federation of colleges, and teaching in Cambridge is now perhaps more in lectures, but teaching in the 19th century was a college matter, and professors were university professors, and they did no teaching. They might have held lectures or might not, but it had absolutely nothing to do with the education really of the people going through what first of all became the ordinary degree or the maths tripos. Furthermore, the maths tripos in the and this is here I draw very heavily in my book on a fantastic book by Andrew Warwick, which Gregory Moore has actually wrote a excellent review article about it in the Australian Journal. That basically Warwick points out that the maths tripos was in a sense the only game in town, and actually wasn't even taught in colleges that much. It's actually what was important about gaining a good degree. It was one feature of the maths tripos. It was a ranking, not a classification, and so to get a good ranking in the maths tripos in the first half of the 19th century, particularly, you by the 1830s and 1840s, a system of private coaching had emerged, and he also has Warwick also points out this thing that the coach, it's to do with analogy with the coach between London and Cambridge and teams of horses, and so the coaching system involved a private coach driving his teams through all these kind of mathematical problems, which importantly, and this is the key thing which Marshall picked up on, because Marshall was graduated in 1865, the maths tripos, and he was part of this system. The basic gist of the maths tripos was to train students in all kinds of problem solving or instruments for solving problems, a kind of an array for solving problems. And then in the examinations, which were lengthy over several days, they would be given papers in which they had quickly to decide which instrument they needed to solve the problem that they were presented with. And so this was a kind of, and so basically the coaching system was of private coaches having a small group of bright students who were just driven through chalk and textbooks and so forth through all these systems. They learned all this, and then in the examinations they would apply this knowledge to particular problems that they were confronted with. Now, to just make the contrast start, the moral sciences tripos, as it developed from the 1860s, particularly, I'll talk a bit about this in a minute, but basically moral sciences tripos wasn't like this at all. The moral sciences tripos was a canonical book program, where basically each subject had one main canonical book which you would read and understand, or you would read a classic Greek text and understand that, and then your success in the exam would be to do with how well you had understood this particular text or this particular set of arguments. And so there's the point about the contrast of the maths tripos and the moral sciences tripos is that the maths tripos, in a sense, in the way I've outlined it, should, I hope, give you a sense of where Marshall got his idea of the way in which economics should be taught came from. Whereas the moral sciences tripos, based around, in a sense, great books, including, for example, very good books. I mean, like Sidgwick's Principles of Political Economy, which was 1883, the year he became professor of moral philosophy. He also publishes his fantastic book on political economy, which is massively underrated as a text. I think it has all sorts of things in it. Sidgwick is an absolutely admirable character, really amazing intellect, Sidgwick. And so the fact that he could write, and also what we should also see in this moral sciences framework is that the famous book of moral philosophy, Methods of Ethics, is very much, you can read it as a treatise in economics. It's a treatise in choice, effectively. Today, Methods of Ethics has been rediscovered by modern moral philosophers who talk about it in their own terms. If you put it back where it was in 1874 when it was published, and in the context of the journal Mind and the sorts of stuff that you find in the journal Mind when it started publication at roughly the same time, you will see a field of knowledge which is not contained by modern ideas of moral philosophy. Moral philosophers today, as with Smith, do to Sidgwick what economists long did to Adam Smith, and kind of impose their own ideas on him and understand him in their own sort of way. So basically, we have the maths tripos and the moral sciences tripos. Important to recognize that the maths tripos is a system of general education. It is not a training for mathematicians. Not until the natural sciences tripos was created in the early 1870s, does actually does the maths tripos become a training for mathematicians, because the person Alfred Marshall was second wrangler. He came second in 1865. The person who came first was Lord Rayleigh. He won a Nobel Prize for physics, I think it was, in 1904. And so several of leading British scientists came through the maths tripos in the sort of the 1860s and early 1870s. But then once we founded the natural sciences tripos, they went through that route, and the maths tripos became, at that point, for the first time, a more focused mathematical tripos. But what happened basically with the moral sciences tripos is, going back to Prince Albert, given his discovery about what was going on in Cambridge in 1848, a moral sciences degree was created, which is like a postgraduate degree, like the classics degree. You had to do maths first, and then you could do about 9 months of moral sciences and you got a second degree, like the classics degree was a second degree. In 1860, the idea this was more altered, and so actually a freestanding moral sciences degree, but with different content to what became the case, was set up. And so from 1860, there's a moral sciences board, and therefore the moral sciences degree, Tripos, existed from 1860 onwards. In 1868, so Marshall graduated in 1865. In 1868, he became the college lecturer in moral sciences for Johns, the same as Sidgwick for Trinity next door in the same year. So you have both Sidgwick and Marshall in 1868 becoming professors, becoming college lecturers in moral sciences. And I mean, I won't go into this. I've outlined in my paper on in the latest the Raffaelli Festschrift on the development of the moral sciences in Cambridge. There's a complicated story about discussions among philosophers and others, a thing called the Grote Club in the 1860s, which is really important for all of this, but I really can't go on to talk about that. But basically, what I'm trying to emphasize in looking at this is that if we want to understand the way in which economics develops or economics comes into consideration in Cambridge, then we have to look at the structure of the maths tripos, how that worked, and understand that this is the model for the way in which Marshall thought of his teaching. It's about how do you communicate a body of knowledge to students? How do they manipulate this knowledge? What resources do they use? Marshall did not teach in principles when he lectured. Importantly, also, that unusually, and this was so that when he was appointed in late 1884, he sort of arrives in Cambridge early 1885, and almost immediately he puts a notice in the Cambridge University Reporter saying he would be happy to meet students for discussion or to lend books to them and so forth. And that was a practice he continued throughout his life in Cambridge. Interestingly, also, of course, I mean, once his house was built, the Balliol Lodge, he doesn't seem to have used college rooms at all. College wasn't at all central to him, nor was it to Foxwell. Foxwell lived in his house near the station, commuted to London. Marshall was the other side of town. They wrote to each other. They never seem to have met in college. College was not important. They're both at the same college, St. John's. They never met in college, which was actually on the line between their two houses. But so basically, this was highly unusual. The idea that a professor would encourage students just to turn up at his house and ask him questions, and this was an important feature. And this was the way he taught. And we got several reports of how he taught and what he taught. We've got a complete listing from 1891, 92 of one of his main course of lectures. And if we look at that, and he basically doesn't teach in terms of principles. He teaches in terms of economic affairs and various sorts of materials. So it seems that Edwin Cannon, there is a set of notes, and they seem to be from Cannon. There's some doubt about that at the moment, which we can't clear up until we can check handwriting back in the LSE archive when it opens again. But there is a course of his lectures, and all of the accounts of his lecturing emphasizes this kind of way in which he would talk apparently randomly about things, and he hated for students to take notes. The lectures weren't didactic; they were designed to try and stimulate the thoughts of the students. Now, importantly, just to finish here, how the book finishes is to point out that this is precisely not what Lionel Robbins did in LSE. Lionel Robbins certainly was certainly a very, very arrogant and quite unpleasant young man in the late 1920s, and thought very much of himself. But he didn't know as much theory as he thought he did. His knowledge of German certainly wasn't what he thought it was, and he didn't know. He was a young man. He just didn't have the experience and the knowledge. I mean, Marshall had been to the States in 1875 for a long period and taken loads of notes. He hadn't had any of this kind of experience at all. And what Robbins did was develop a didactic teaching style. He would, rather than Marshall, where he would just talk about things, he had a series of cribs and so forth, of quotations he could use and so, whatever. Lionel Robbins would write out his lecture, so basically more or less write it out in full, and read it through and learn it, and then deliver it freely. And and he was always said to be an excellent lecturer. Everyone reports him as being an excellent lecturer because he was authoritative. He spoke freely. He talked, he mastered this material. And so this, in a sense, masked his lack of theoretical sophistication and also his real lack of empirical knowledge. I mean, and in a sense, that's testified by the Great Depression. There's a terrible book on the Depression. I think he learned as he went through, but certainly if we're looking at this kind of how he set the model of teaching up in LSE in the 1930s, this is the way he taught, and we do have his lecture notes. Susan Housen has published his lecture notes, and so we know what his lectures, because he did write them down, we actually have them, and we can see what it was he taught. And so the kind of didactic, principled teaching of principles was something which was introduced by Robbins, and which then entered the British textbooks, and which then, as a sense, became a model along with other textbooks. I mean, Stigler comes along in the 1940s, and so there's a bigger story to be told there. But what I'd contrast with is say that, looking back, say that there is this kind of style of teaching economics develops in Britain in the 1930s, and is not explicitly not the style that Marshall fostered or believed in. And where Marshall got his model from, I would say, is the maths tripos. This idea that a trained and competent graduate or graduate should be able to identify a problem and choose a particular appropriate instrument for analyzing and elaborating that problem. This is the sort of work we can see in a book. You can see early Pigou doing exactly this. You can see early Sidney Chapman in his book on cotton doing exactly this. You can see Maynard Keynes doing exactly this. This is all the kind of Marshallian tradition, but it is a way of thinking and acting which, in a sense, this Robbins style of teaching set out to basically choke off or to put one side. The basic problem with that form is that you need to know an awful lot. You need to be an extremely skilled theoretician. You need also to be to just know a lot of diverse factual knowledge. I don't know if it's still there. I was thinking of writing to the Marshall librarian, but in the 1990s, once when I was in the Marshall Library, there was I was asked about I was asking about Marshall's sources, and they said they pointed me to the back wall. So I don't know, about 20 foot wide, and there was a single shelf along the back, and on that they had boxes of all the bits and pieces that Marshall had torn out of magazines and journals and so forth, all the kind of various assorted empirical material that he had actually gathered together. A vast amount of material. As I say, I don't know where it's still there, but it's just physically very impressive that he had collected all this random material. And so, you know, I think it's this combination. What Marshall was seeking to do in creating the economics tripos was to create a vehicle for, on the one hand, training the intellect to be able to identify problems and how they should be resolved and have the appropriate techniques and instruments to require to do that. But on the other hand, have at the back this great empirical foundation of knowledge, which would enable individuals to be able to judge effectively what the most appropriate means would be. So I'll say I'll stop there. Sorry, I've gone on a bit longer than I meant to.
Thank you very much, Keith. That's a very interesting sequence of, well, very interesting sequence of the moral sciences, triposes, and economics in a broader project framing. So that's great. Can I just now call for any questions? I'm not sure I'm very good at managing technology, so Tushar might be able to identify people better than me. Is any questions?
So they're not in the chat so far, but if there's anyone who wants to raise a hand and ask a question, please go for it.
Paul Oslington. Yep.
I think Greg was first.
Okay.
I'm not quite sure how to put up my hand electronically on this machine. So, hello, Keith.
Hi, hello.
You kindly made reference to my commentary on the mathematical tripos earlier in your narrative. My question relates to the mathematical tripos. It seems that you're emphasizing that the main product of the mathematical tripos for the economic tripos, as Marshall implemented it, is this concept of an engine of discovery, which would not be along the lines that Robbins would push economics, a process by which students would learn when to use the machine and not use the machine. But I would suggest that there are a number of other themes that came out of the mathematical tripos that you haven't really emphasized. And the most obvious is the peculiar tradition in economics, until recently at least, of using Cartesian space in the mathematical tripos because it was applied mathematics and they wanted to keep it concrete for the students. They're all encouraged to draw cylinders and other machinery in which they're applying their mathematical skills to comprehend. And that was carried over into the Cambridge tradition and beyond. And it wasn't necessarily carried on in other traditions, such as the Austrian tradition and elsewhere. And it really is through the mathematical tripos students that I believe that this concept of representing our ideas in Cartesian space comes from. You might mention this elsewhere in your book, but I would have thought that that would be an institutional feature that would be really, really dramatic in the forming of the economic doctrine that we see of that period and all the way through until recently.
Yeah, well, that's, it's a pity you didn't raise that point a year ago, and I would have been able to do something about it, because that's an excellent point. And no, I can see where you're going, but no, I suppose that as I've outlined in this chapter, which I've written about this, is that I was mainly concerned to contrast the mathematics tripos as an organized, as simply as a functional teaching system. I mean, aside from the very important points you've raised, with the moral sciences tripos, and also with classics, and also which I haven't mentioned, is the chapter which follows, there's 3 chapters on Cambridge, but the chapter follows is to say, why not Oxford? And say, well, Marshall was in Oxford in 1884. He was waiting to become professor of political economy in Oxford. But even if he had become professor of political economy, could he have actually done the same thing? And the answer is no, because of the way I go about looking at the way classics and history was under examining, and the colleges were all organized in Oxford. And so in a sense, I suppose what you could say is that my argument is primarily institutional and sociological, which doesn't at all rule out the points you're making, but it remains at that level, because in a sense, I was actually thinking that's a sort of like an Adam Smith kind of like it is sufficient for my purposes to make, because I'm looking at the substance of the teaching, the commerce stuff on the one hand, and I'm looking forward to the way in which this is all changed in the late 1920s, early 1930s, through London and LSE. So I'm looking at institutions. So what your point is, yes, very, very important, but it's not a line of argument I pursue very much, because I think probably when I was reading Warwick's book and starting to understand this, I felt that this would just take me off on a line of argument that would be very difficult to, it'd be like a thread which would be very difficult to tie up through the subsequent chapters on why not Oxford, what happened to historical economics, why was historical economics never a prospect, what commercial education was like in France and United States and Germany, what commercial education was like in Britain outside the LSE, and finally arriving at the LSE, and then finally at Robbins. And so, in a sense, the path that my book takes is the low road, basically, I would say, of that institutional and organizational path.
Paul.
Yeah.
Thanks, Keith. I was reflecting on the way you went about this in relation to the way we write the history of Australian economics. I think the way that the history of Australian economics is often written is we are looking for Australian contributions to the research frontier. We want to fly the flag for the Australian contributions. But it struck me listening to you that is a way of writing the history of Australian economics, which is deeply at odds with the way Australian economists practiced up until probably 10 years ago, where their overwhelming focus was teaching. And I wonder, I was just reflecting that, can we rewrite the history of Australian economics in terms of the cultural influence of the economics teaching? It's harder because it means tracing their students and tracing their influence. But that was just a really interesting point from the way you went about it. But the question I want to ask you was about, in relation to teaching as well. It seems to me that the Robbins way of going about teaching economics was the one that was transported to America and was overwhelmingly the model of teaching over there. Do you have any comments on the influence of that shift from the Marshall way of teaching to the Robbins way of teaching had on the way that economics was taught overseas, particularly in the US?
Well, first, yes. I mean, yes, I can say. I mean, hang on, I'll just write a note about that. So first, your sort of preamble point. There is one very, very good book on on the organization of teaching and how the profession, how economists work, which is on post-war Germany, in German. I reviewed it in German history, so I've got a review of it. But this is basically one of those books that no one would have heard about. But basically, the Germans, of course, kept very good records, and this actually reconstitutes very carefully the students, staffing, and importantly, the role of private institutions. There was a lot of private institutions employing economists in Germany in the 1950s and 1960s, or sort of research or consultancies, effectively, I suppose we call them today. So this book, so that's a model. I mean, in the sense of looking at how teaching and what is taught, and also what comes out of this book is the way that the Germans in the 50s, all the stuff we hear about is the social market economists and stuff. He says, no, actually, that the Germans were original Keynesians. That actually, not American Keynesians, they weren't Americanized. Just, this idea of Americanization is premature. The Japanese economists in the 1950s and 60s weren't Americanized, and nor were the Germans, and they had a connect. So there is a template for this idea of how you would go about looking at what is done, but it's in German. As for the thing about the style of teaching, when you were talking, it reminded me that there are two. I mean, and I do cite them in my book. The American style, what we know is from Roger Backhouse's biography of Paul Samuelson, and his very clear account of how teaching in how Samuelson was taught by Weiner in Chicago in the mid-30s, and the kind of the kind of sense of the classroom teaching, which was akin to the sort of thing that Marshall was doing. Also, one of my interviewees I didn't not published, Dennis Kopok, spent a year in Chicago, and was it Chicago? Well, he was in Chicago at one point, in Columbia and Chicago, I think. Anyway, he would have been in, he would have been in MIT, because he was taught by Samuelson in about 1947 or 48, something like that. And Samuelson, basically what he said, he got the class to do the work. He would sort of write up stuff and get them, he would work them through problems, but getting them to do the work. So I think there'll be a lot. I mean, I would lay no claim to any kind of expertise on interwar American economics and its development and how it's taught and so forth. And I don't think there's a lot of work being done on that. But from these two examples, I mean, I think there's a great mileage in just looking at how this material is conveyed. How, that on the one hand, Samuelson would have, from the text, his two big books would appear to be, in a sense, a very didactic kind of way of teaching. But in fact, and of course, Kopok's talking about graduate classes again, as Roger is talking about Samuelson sitting in Weiner's graduate class in Chicago, just sitting in on the class. And so that provides you with an insight into, if this is the way Weiner worked and this is the way that Samuelson worked to graduate classes. What we don't know is how this worked with respect to undergraduate teaching, for example. What I do know is, by sheer chance, I can't remember how, a month or so ago, I saw a couple of undergraduate lectures videoed, and just they were appalling. I mean, in economics, they're appallingly slow and didactic. I mean, just so unimaginative. I mean, it was so much more like the Robbins model. So really, it's I think what I've got is a conjecture that of looking at styles of teaching which involves different ways of conceptualizing what economics is and how the economist is meant to think about the material that to hand.
Thanks, Keith.
If
I
I
might
could
take.
just
Sorry.
briefly follow. One of the curiosities, Keith, listening to your comments, is that Viner and Robbins, of course, were great friends, and that Viner had been across to LSE and spent a semester or a year or something with Robbins. And yet, I agree completely. Viner's method of teaching in his famous 301 course was very much the Marshall way of teaching, but yet the whole American thing was much more didactic. It was sort of one of those curiosities, I think. But anyway, others can have their shot.
I might just ask a quick question, Keith. As you know, there was a controversy over the appointment of Marshall's successor. There was an expectation that Foxwell would succeed Marshall, and it was Pigou. I'm wondering whether that's part of this story, that is, if establishing the economics tripos in the form that you're suggesting, the way of teaching that you're suggesting, is there any evidence that Foxwell was not so on board with this problem addressing way of teaching that Pigou was, and that was part of the reason for his appointment?
Well, I don't think it was that didn't come into his appointment. But in my conclusion, I talk about all this earlier in the book in detail. Aslan Begu and Oates have actually shown that the appointment committee was unanimous in appointing Pigou. There was no doubt about that. In my conclusion, I come back to that and point out that one of the strange, it comes back to the point Paul's made, that I say, well, isn't it strange, that historians of economists talk about what happened in the past and so forth, and they don't use their own institutional knowledge. They work as though, somehow this is where they don't think of themselves as being an institution which works to particular, the careers are created. I sat and make the joke and say, well, when economists gather together, they don't talk about the latest papers in the EJ or the AER. They talk about who's up and who's down, that's basically, and so this is a career. This is talking about career stuff. But they don't think in those ways when they go back. And so when we're talking about Foxwell and appointment, now Foxwell, it's a ridiculous idea that Foxwell would have succeeded Marshall. There was Marshall long complained that Foxwell wouldn't do any marking of papers. Marshall would set papers, he would mark stuff, and so he wouldn't do any of that. So basically what I say, well, if you're presented this cold, you're as a modern institutional person, and Pigou was a modern institutional person. So you've got one candidate who's 60, who hasn't published really anything for about 20 years, apart from his introduction to Menger, the right to the whole produce of labour, and one short thing. And then you've got a bright young person who's not even 30, who's published a whole raft of stuff in the last 4 or 5 years. He writes the lead piece in the tariff controversy, the riddle of the tariff, brilliant piece of writing. And why on earth would Foxwell think that he had a chance against someone like that? There was it's Foxwell's petulance. But what's happened is that he had a petulant reaction, and the kind of the past history. I know there was a surprise at the time. I was led from Sydney Webb to Ashley. So, but this is Pigou was the obvious choice. The other candidates were Cannon and Ashley and Fox. That none of these people would secure this Marshallian heritage. I mean, Ashley was a hopeless teacher. Well, he did have a seminar. He had one in Toronto, and he had one in in Birmingham, and actually students kept a minute book in Toronto, which is sort of okay, but then also in Birmingham there's a minute book of what happened in this seminar, and it's pretty low. It's extremely low level, and Cannon really was quite unsympathetic to this kind of mode of working, what the Tripos was. So none of these people, so that it's just, why is it that that there are these tropes? This is kind of carried on and on. I mean, it's the same sort of stuff about Ashley, and the other career question I raise is, well, why on earth was Ashley appointed to found the founding Faculty of Commerce in Birmingham? He had absolutely no experience in teaching commerce or economics even, really. The only rationale one can actually identify is in liberal imperialism, because Chamberlain was very powerful in the general institution, the kind of setting up of University of Birmingham. It's just a political connection. I mean, there's, for want of any better explanation, that's the only explanation one can think of. And of course, Ashley did go on to write the liberal imperialist defense of imperial preference in the same year as well, it was still a month or so before Pigue's publication.
Yep.
So, this is, but and people keep on saying about, Birmingham, the first Faculty of Commerce and so forth. I think it was a complete failure. When Ashley died and retired, when the place became vacant, what did they do? They appointed as a replacement another, in the mid-1920s, another economic historian from Lincoln College, Oxford. The program hadn't even managed to, at that point, apparently, I mean, it's not quite true, but it hadn't apparently managed even to create a pool of people who might become successors to the professor. The Faculty of Commerce, it wasn't until Sergeant Florence was appointed in 1929-30 that Birmingham turned around, and he imposed industrial organization. And then in the 1940s, sheer fluke led to Gorman and others being, so the whole thing went off in a different direction. But this, so there's a kind of undertow of these kinds of older stories that kind of get reproduced through the literature. And so what I say, for example, with Ashley, if you look at the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, you will see it's just a farrago of all these kinds of this misinformation about Ashley and so forth, which is not to do with Ashley per se. I mean, it's not his fault. It's simply that there's a kind of, these things get repeated on and on without you going back to the original things. Well, hang on a minute, how did this happen? And we should use, in doing this, we should use our institutional knowledge. We say, would we think about this kind of appointment or what that way today?
Sorry, so I think Gregory has his hand up, but can I quickly ask a question that's there in the chat from Allison?
11 o'clock, and then I'm going to the District Union Club lunch.
Sorry about that.
Sorry, what?
Yeah, so Allison has a question in the chat, and her internet is unstable, so she has not been able to ask it herself. So she says, really interesting lecture, and she has a comment that Robbins would have loved to teach online. But then she says that her question is, we know that the number of females reading economics is on the decline, and the style of teaching is considered a part of the problem. Are you able to comment on what could be possible solutions? Well, she's not here, but it's on record, so she can watch it later. So do you have any suggestions, Keith? Well,
no, I don't. I mean, my initial comment is that, I mean, in the 1990s, we would, well, it's actually still the same. That half our students are female, at least. I mean, so what happens? What is it about? And it's not because of science, because we know there are, shed loads of really competent young life science and life sciences and natural science and engineers and so forth who are female now. So I really don't know. I mean, the only thing that occurs to me is the more it's actually now 3 or 4 or 5 years old, is the studies which David Colander put together about graduate education in the United States. And I think probably, and which is a fairly sort of damning and account of why economics at graduate school is taught the way it is and how it's perpetuated. And I think perhaps it would be through looking at studies of that kind of thing, which we might start to get some kind of sense about why it is that what it is about the culture that means that women find it very hard to gain advancement.
Thank you. Gregory, you had a question?
I was going to ask a question on competing institutional possibilities, but I'll just put that one to one side because I don't want to chew up time. It's coming very late. So instead, I just want to challenge you a bit on your narrative relating to Ashley. I think you're being far too hard on Ashley. The biggest fan of Ashley's was in fact Alfred Marshall, and Ashley's 2-volume account of economic history was an extraordinary product, integrated a lot of German historical economic work and made it available to the English public. I suggest that you're right for the wrong reason. The reason why Ashley was such a failure in competing for the high-end spoils was not because he lacked scholarship, but because he was from a working class background with a speech impediment. His college fellowship in Oxford was rejected 3 times on the grounds that we don't want that type of fellow in our company. It was very sad. And in the student accounts of his time at Birmingham, they all refer to his crippling shyness, his inability to speak to them in a charismatic fashion. So just wanted to sort of put that record straight, because I'm a great admirer of Ashley's scholarship. As I said, Marshall and others were at the time.
Well, yeah, I mean, no, I mean, I'm not. I agree. I mean, I agree entirely about the Birmingham record, but I would say that in the middle of my chapter on historical economics, one of I have a long section on Toynbee's book on the Industrial Revolution, and I think I demonstrate that most of what is good about that book, or most of what was being received, is down to Ashley. You can demonstrate by looking at Toynbee reports of how Toynbee talked and wrote that basically the coherence of what is not demonstrably Toynbee in there is down to Ashley's work. And because Bolton King, who he worked with, was a 3rd-year undergraduate at the time, unlikely that he was going. So I think Ashley had the major input into pulling that book together, and what the book became famous for was his. Basically, that's a kind of great unknown book, and I agree about the 2 volumes. But that's, and so yes, I think that Marshall would have admired them. I mean, because he had a very eclectic and very wide-ranging. But it's to do with really, in the sense that Ashley, in my view, is that Ashley did remain very, very stuck in the 1880s in terms of the development of economy. He couldn't see any point in the new economics, as it were, as represented by someone like Pigou.
Just a qualification.
Can I just come in here and just firstly thank everyone for their patience because of the delay, which was my fault, and I'm just conscious that it's getting late, and I'm happy to continue because it's such an interesting topic and there's good questions to come. But I would like to thank people and to say that if you have dinner to go to or event to go to, please feel free to leave the meeting with our thanks and appreciation for attending. If you wish to stay and continue the discussion, if Keith is willing to stay and continue the discussion too, because he's been on a long time, then that would be fine. Thank you very much for coming, and please feel free to leave if you have other events. Is there anyone else who has any questions of those who wish to stay?
Thank you, Keith and Michael. Bye.
Yep. Sorry, I can't see who was speaking.
So it was just Frank saying bye.
Oh, okay. Yep, thanks. I hope I haven't killed or something halfway through because it's gone quiet. What about Greg? Did you want to raise the issue that you shelved?
I might write to Keith directly. It was relating to something that he read of mine quite a while ago, and it might not be that relevant. So I think I'll just continue it in correspondence.
Gotcha.
I'll let someone else chat.
Okay.
But I'll just say thanks, Keith. I really enjoyed the speech.
Well, thanks for. I'm going to say I come back. The thing about Ashley is that I have looked at the Toronto stuff. I mean, so looking what he did in Toronto, and also I managed to piece together what he was doing in Harvard. My comment about his successor was that he did find himself in a position which was very difficult, and he did actually get a supporter, Kirkcaldy, who helped him. But the main problem he struggled with in Birmingham was the faulty design, that it was for school leavers. There were hardly any students, local employers. There was no culture in Birmingham really for commercial education, unlike Manchester, unlike Liverpool, and that's the contrast that I draw. I talk about really, in Liverpool was the real motor, in a sense that when they founded the university college, whenever they wanted a professorship, they immediately got the money in to do that, which was unlike elsewhere. Manchester from the mid-19th century had a thriving culture of adult and other kind of education, and that was not, Birmingham just didn't have any of that at all. And so he was founding a commerce faculty in a sense in a desert effect, in effect, compared with what happened in Liverpool and Manchester, and to some extent also in Leeds. And so he was in a very difficult position in Birmingham, I think.
I think we've reached a natural pause. If there's any other questions, Rico, can I perhaps draw attention to you? Is there anything that's your studies of Marshall has been inspired by Keith's comments, or do you have any queries?
No, just thanks to Keith for the presentation, and the overall narrative was interesting and quite clear. One sort of passing question was sort of, to what extent would you consider, you were talking about Robbins's introduction of a textbook way of teaching. To what extent would Marshall's principles have been considered a textbook? I guess the way in which that content that was conveyed in the principles, which all of the students could almost regurgitate, but I guess maybe there was an element that they had to apply that in a sense that other types of textbooks are different. Is that?
Well, it's this one, this is the one, the Economics of Industry from 1890, the 1892 book. This was the one that that was I mean, Marshall, the principles did sell. I mean, large numbers, and we got all the numbers tonight. But for students, what was most useful was this boiled down version of it, the new Economics of Industry, I think. So, I mean, there was a sense. I believed this a few years ago. There was a sense in which the idea is, once he created the principles, I mean, well, it's go either way. Peter Groenewegen said, well, once he got the principles, then he didn't need to teach principles. Or you could say, well, he could use the principles to teach. I mean, so it could be either way. But I don't think there's a change in the way that the publication of the principles in 1890 didn't change the way that Marshall taught or his general pedagogic routine. I mean, there is a very short account of a female student, a Newnham student, who goes to see him, and just from the short description of how she describes what happened, the terrible social embarrassment when he says, "What's your question?" And everyone, the two students with her, none of them could think of a question, and he says, "What is your question?" And and this is kind of, but and then she says, and then someone thought, she did or someone else thought of a question, and then he was very interesting. But the point was, he refused to tell them what they should think. He wanted them to ask him a question to which he could respond, and they could have a discussion about it and so forth. Which and that's it. That kind of relationship, I think, is something that he must have. That was why he put this notice in the Reporter in 1885, and this is kind of this kind of routine. I mean, obviously, not in the kind of easy way that we might imagine it today, but the point is that that was very different, and I think he was always consistent like this. How the principles was used is I mean, given, if you look at the sales figures, are very significant, but say the plates wore out they paperbacked it in the late 1940s because the plates wore out, and so I don't really have an image of how it was used, and how that happened in teaching. And none of the people I interviewed, they would talk in general about the text, but wouldn't talk in terms of how they'd used it. So, and now they're all gone, so we can't find out. But that's important. I mean, so a textbook exists, and actually also to extend that, in my chapter on Robbins, I do summarize briefly all the American texts, for example, that Robbins referred to, and look at because I'm looking for kind of models for how he goes about teaching, and what the kind of bits and pieces, the graphs and exposition and so forth. And so look at Tausig and others, and basically what we need to know is how these things are used, and that's something which we got the sales figures, but we haven't got any clear idea of the way it was used by students, I think, in studying economics.
Cool, thanks.
Thanks very much, Keith. It's good to have a PhD student have the last question and then you to answer it nice and clearly. I just end by saying, look, thank you very much. We've had a really enjoyable hour and a half with you, and thanks for supporting history of economics at UWA and intellectual history more generally. And we'll see you around, hopefully at a HETSA conference, if not another conference.
Well, this year or next year? Not this year.
Yeah.
Well, thanks.
Yes, it'll be next year.
Thanks very much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure. Thanks a lot indeed.
Good. Thanks, Keith. Right. Cheers. Bye.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye.